Okay, they are still a little bright. Hi, everybody. This is a little more daunting than our normal setup. Welcome, everybody. And tonight, if you haven't figured it out already, we're thrilled to be hosting our friend Kimmery Martin for her actual launch day for her latest book, Doctors and Friends. It's her third novel. Kimmery's had an action-packed schedule leading up to today because I know she went to Kentucky this weekend. And now she's headed out on a post-COVID actual live event tour. So she's going to be a busy lady, and we are thrilled to be a part of it. This is also our first event in the new Gambrell Center, and we are excited to christen this with the start of our 50th anniversary year with this special event. Please stay tuned for details on the fast approaching November 19th Holiday Books and Coffee with Denise Kiernan, and please try to attend. Just as a quick introduction, many of you know of Kimmery as one of our hometown nationally recognized authors, and we're so proud of all of them, but tonight especially of Kimmery. She's an ER doc turned novelist who began toying with her writing career as a first grader when she won a stuffed animal and was publicized in her school newspaper. She had some truly nonfiction works published during her medical school days, including, and I'm going to have to read this word for word, lymphatic mapping and sentinel lymph node biopsy in the staging of melanoma, and its sequel, sentinel lymph node biopsy for pelvic malignancies. So we're very glad that she's changed her focus. After completing medical studies at the University of Louisville School of Medicine and then Vanderbilt University, Kimmery practiced emergency room medicine for years in Charlotte and talked her fellow doctor hubby and her children into embracing her new career of becoming a full-time writer, which we can all imagine requires support of family, especially 3 children who I happen to know are not toddlers, but certainly still all at home and at times quite demanding. Doctors and Friends joins her earlier 2 novels, The Queen of Hearts and The Antidote for Everything, as perhaps the most eye-catching books on the shelves. I know I'm always drawn to them because the cover art is beautiful. All 3 have beautiful cover art in a day where I've recently noticed that many books on the shelves all look the same. So kudos to Kimmery and her right brain, which is clearly as active as her left. I'm not going to spoil her introduction to this latest book, but let's just say that one might begin to wonder if she has a crystal ball in her bag of tricks. I can't wait to read it. So and she will be back out in the front where Parker Books has the table for buying more books if you didn't get to before the event.
Thank you, Sheridan, for that fabulous introduction. That made me laugh about 4 times. I am so grateful to y'all for having me here tonight. This feels so good to be talking to actual people, and I am a huge fan of Friends of the Library and libraries in general. So y'all are my people. Thank you for what you do, and thank you to Queens also for having me tonight. Now, before I talk about the book, I'm curious if anyone here has seen the Saturday Night Live skit with Kristen Wiig and one of the Jonas Brothers, and they are playing the part of 2 people who have emerged from a pandemic, and they meet in a bar, and they cannot quite remember how to behave as humans in public. So they get everything a little bit wrong. They're trying to flirt with each other, and they're saying weird things, and they want to dance together. So they ask the piano player to play Take Me Out to the Ball Game. And that is basically me right now, because it has been such a long time since I've done one of these live author talks. It feels very strange not to be staring into a green dot, to actually see people out there. So I have done a lot of virtual talks, as have all authors, over the last couple of years. And one of the unfortunate side effects of that is that I have developed a awkward, high-pitched laugh at my own jokes. because usually, everybody else is muted and I can't tell if anyone thinks it's funny. So I'm going to try so hard not to do that tonight. Now, the other thing I have done a lot over the last couple of years is television interviews. And the reason for that is because not only am I a physician, but I'm a physician who wrote a novel about a pandemic. And then along the way, I contracted COVID myself and had long-term symptoms from it. So I kind of found myself in demand from television people. And the way that they do these taped-ahead interviews is they might talk to you for about 40 minutes or so, and then they condense it down to 1 or 2 minutes. And I know this, and yet I cannot stop myself from providing really stupid sound bites. So the first time I did one, I watched it as it aired live, as it aired after it had been taped, and the first thing I saw was my face against a blue background, and whizzing around my head in an orbit were these corona balls, like cartoon corona balls. And then I opened my mouth and said, "I am really super dizzy all the time." And I did, in fact, say that. I had many intelligent medical things to say as well, but for obvious reasons, that's the soundbite that they chose. And so all of this to say, this might not be the most polished author talk that you ever hear, so I thank you guys for sticking with me tonight. Before I get into the specifics of the new book, I have learned on my previous book tours that people are usually interested in the backstories, the author's background and the backstory of the novels. And in my case, I get a lot of questions about how I became a writer because I have been so blessed to have these 2 great career passions in my life. And one is obviously literature, but the other is the practice of medicine. So I was an emergency medicine doctor, and I do really love the practice of emergency medicine. Are there any ER doctors in the crowd here, or any doctors in the crowd? Oh my God, hi guys. Thank you for coming. So I do love the practice of emergency medicine. I think it's incredibly rewarding to be able to make an immediate impact in the life of a human being who is ill or injured or suffering. And I liked the pace of the field. I liked the procedures and the problem solving. I liked the camaraderie with the people that you work with. I like the patience. But also all of my life, I have been a really fanatical, obsessive reader, like you guys, I'm assuming. And I decided at some point, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, that I wanted to try my hand at doing the thing that has given me so much joy in my life when other people have done it, and that is writing. So I wrote my first novel. It's called The Queen of Hearts, set here in Charlotte, and they do have copies upstairs if you haven't read it. That story was about a friendship between a cardiologist, hence the title, and a trauma surgeon, and one of them is hiding this big, significant secret from the other one. And it's not even really what the secret is, that's the point of the book, but why she was doing it. And writing that book was a long, humbling process, full of failure. I might have mentioned this to some of you before, but when I was querying agents, trying to get a literary agent to represent me, I sent over 100 emails to them with either no reply or a rejection. And it got to the point where I would feel my face flame up in shame when I would hear the email noise on my computer because I knew it was going to be another rejection. So eventually I did get an agent and I did get the book published. And that book wound up being reviewed in the New York Times, and it changed my life. I decided to focus on writing a little bit more. Now, my second novel, The Antidote for Everything, released just as COVID released in early 2020. So not a lot of people read that book. It also is about a medical friendship. This one is between a urologist and a family medicine doctor, and what goes really spectacularly wrong between them when one of them is unjustly fired. So both of these books are a little bit of spin-offs of each other. One minor character in one book will be the protagonist in the next book, and so forth. So that leads me to Doctors and Friends, the third book. And I think this is where it kind of gets more interesting because, and I always tell people this when I talk about the timing of the book, I first had the idea for it in an article I wrote in 2018 and pitched it to my editor and sold it to the publisher and researched it and drafted it in 2019. And the reason that that is relevant is because the book is about an infectious disease doctor at the CDC, and she's traveling with her medical school girlfriends during what turns out to be the start of a brand new worldwide viral pandemic. And originally, my publisher was going to pitch the novel to the media as The Hot Zone meets Sophie's Choice. So, if you have read either of those books, you are now cringing. The main character, the infectious disease doctor, has two children. One is a little boy, one is a teenage girl. And near the end of the pandemic, which she has been helping to formulate the tactical American response to, near the end of the pandemic, both of her children become deathly ill. And she happens to have access to one dose of an experimental antiviral medication. And she has to pick which child will receive it. Now, I know that sounds implausible, but like many novels, there were real events actually that sort of loosely inspired this storyline. Many years ago, I read The Great Influenza by John Barry, which is a nonfiction account of the calamitous 1918 influenza pandemic. That was a pandemic that was so virulent that you could have a young, healthy adult who would be fine in the morning and be dead by dinner time. And one of the reasons for that was the more robust your immune system, the more the virus sort of turned your body against itself. And that had this really sort of outsized impact on my imagination. So I was originally envisioning writing about a form of superflu, but I was going to combine maybe some of the hemorrhagic nature of Ebola with the pulmonary devastation of certain forms of influenza and the contagiousness of measles, which is one of the most contagious viruses that we know. And I was crowdsourcing a group of online infectious disease doctors, epidemiologists, virologists, and asking them to give me suggestions for characteristics of the worst possible virus that they could imagine. And I didn't wind up using all of their suggestions because my fictional people had to be able to overcome this thing in the end. But I used a lot of them. And I did not wind up using influenza or some variant of influenza in the book because I ultimately thought, it's going to be confusing if I have the name of a real virus in here. So I made up a virus. And then in mid-2019, as part of the research I was doing for the novel, I read a book by Richard Preston called Crisis in the Red Zone. And this book was about, it's nonfiction, was about the 2014 Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. And I bet that a lot of you will find this next story kind of familiar because it was widely reported in the news media, especially in Charlotte. There was an aid camp, a medical aid camp that Samaritan's Purse was running in Sierra Leone. And two of the medical workers there, a doctor and another, I forget if it was a nurse or another medical worker, both contracted Ebola. And completely coincidentally, the director of the aid camp, a doctor named Kent Brantley, realized that he had access to one dose of an experimental antiviral medication called ZMapp. And at this time, ZMapp was almost entirely theoretical. It had never been given to a single human being. And if you want to know how he happened to have access to this drug, which there were only, I think, 6 doses in the entire world in existence at that time. So if you want to know how he happened to get that, you should read Crisis in the Red Zone, because it's a fascinating book with a lot of interesting ethical dilemmas in it. But he did have access to it. And he faced this brutal decision, which was which of his 2 dying colleagues should he treat? Or should he treat either of them at all, because giving them this medication might kill them? And he'd be administering this drug to people in a position of relative privilege. There were people dying all around of Ebola at that time. So in his estimation, both of his colleagues were within a couple hours of death at the time. And he did wind up administering the drug. And when I was reading about the accounts of this, having to choose between these 2 people, I immediately had the same thought that all of you have right now, which is, what if those 2 people had been his children? I'm kidding. The only person that thinks that is a writer, I'm sure. But lest you guys think that I'm a complete psychopath, the mantra of all fiction writers is to give your characters the worst possible moral dilemma that you can, and then up the ante even further, again, within the limits of plausibility. Now, the initial outbreak in my book did not occur in Sierra Leone, but it did take place in northern Africa. And patient 0 in the book is a doctor traveling from the Central African country of Chad to northern Africa. And so for background, I was interviewing physicians who practice in Chad. And 2 of the people I interviewed are among the people I admire the most in the world. And some of you doctors may have heard this story before, but I was astonished to learn that these 2 doctors, he's an ER doctor, she's an OBGYN, they're married, and they have 5 children. They experienced in real life a very similar scenario to the one in my book, when 4 of their 5 children were exposed to rabies. And you probably know that rabies is a completely fatal disease. It has a 100% fatality rate without treatment. And it is one of the most drawn out, agonizing deaths that you can imagine. Now, I'm not sure if I'm going to tell the outcome of this story all throughout my book tour, but I'm not going to leave you guys hanging tonight. I will tell you, with these doctors' permission, what happened. But I'm really hoping that they write a best-selling memoir someday, because their stories are incredible and fascinating. But of their 4 children, older children, 2 of them were directly scratched or bitten by a rabid cat. And they did not realize that the cat was rabid at first until it started exhibiting symptoms and died. And that was about 3 days later. So if you are going to survive rabies, pretty much the maximum window of time that you have between exposure and symptom onset to treat is maybe 6 days. Once you start showing symptoms, the disease is pretty much 100% fatal. Once it reaches your brain, there's no cure for it. And in this case, the little boy was scratched, I think, on the forearm. The little girl was bitten on the ear. And the more innervated the body part that is exposed, the quicker it usually reaches the brain. So as soon as they figured out what's going on, both parents spring into action, because rabies has a nearly 100% cure rate if the appropriate treatment is administered in that window of time before you start exhibiting symptoms. So the way you treat it is you inject immunoglobulin around the wound, and then you administer a series of vaccines spread out over 28 days. At this point, 3 days had already gone by. So the dad starts calling every hospital, every clinic, every medical supplier, every pharmacy in the country. There is not enough immunoglobulin in the country. In fact, he can't find any. He can find vaccine, but not immunoglobulin. And he tries and tries and tries and tries, and he keeps having repeated false hopes where someone says they have the drug and then then it turns out that they don't, or they have some other drug, or they just didn't know what he was talking about. He wants to courier in a medical supplier to bring in immunoglobulin, but these guys are missionary doctors. They don't have a lot of money. And it's very difficult to fly into or out of Chad. You have to have a visa. You have to go to N'Djamena, the capital. There's a lot of bureaucratic nonsense, and they just can't get anybody into the country in time. So they call the American embassy, who, as it turns out, has immunoglobulin and plenty of it. But they won't turn it over to these two doctors because the doctors are with an NGO. They're not with the government. This is a super expensive drug. If the embassy gives up their supply of it, they do not have any budget to buy more. They can't protect their own employees. They're not, meant to cover every expat in the country. They give all these reasons, but ultimately they point blank refuse to give the children the medication. So the dad is also working with a medical evacuation company. And they come up with a plan. They call him and say, okay, we're going to fly you and the 4 kids, whose ages are 8, 6, 4, and 2, to Nairobi, to a hospital there where, by the way, there is no immunoglobulin, but we're going to offer you an alternative treatment. So there have been a handful of people who have survived rabies after symptoms have started with something called the Milwaukee Protocol, which consists of a lot of rare, expensive antiviral drugs and intensive care. And they probably don't have this at that hospital either. And the few people that have survived that way have had varying degrees of neurologic damage. So the dad says, thank you, but no. He parts ways with the medical evacuation company, which is refusing to do any other plan, and goes back on his own to try to find the drug. So 2 more days pass, and they're almost out of time at this point. The dad keeps on hearing that he's found the drug, and then he keeps finding out that he has not. And then finally, he gets good news. There is a clinic in N'Djamena that's gotten a hold of the immunoglobulin. It costs $3,500, which he doesn't have. But he says, if you'll give the drug to my kids, I will find the money and I will pay you back. And they say, absolutely not. And he writes back and CCs his church in America, and they immediately wire the money. So this is great news. Finally, he has the drug. They head to N'Djamena, and they discover that there is only enough immunoglobulin for 1 child. He literally does have to make a decision. And every time I hear this story, I think about how I would feel if I were in their position with watching my children drift closer and closer to a certain and agonizing death, and everybody that could help them would not help them. They handled the situation with an unbelievable amount of grace. But they had to choose, and so what they did is they decided they would give the immunoglobulin to their little girl because her bite was closer to the brain, and she was out of time. There was officially at this point no way to get the little boy any medication. They did get him on a flight to Paris that was leaving in 2 days, and that's the best that they could do. So as they were about to administer the immunoglobulin to the little girl, the dad did one final thing. He went online and he puts out this desperate plea to a Facebook group consisting of 15,000 emergency medicine doctors. And these are people who immediately understand the implications here. So they burst into action too. They start calling their senators and their representatives, and they call the DOJ and the State Department and the White House and CNN and Fox News. They call every embassy in Africa. They call military bases. They raise enough money to charter a private jet, should one be attainable and be able to get a visa. But the upshot of this is that within 1 hour of this Facebook post, the American embassy in N'Djamena agreed to turn over all of the immunoglobulin to the family. And the children all got it, and they're fine. So that story, although I had not heard it when I wrote the first draft of the book with my character in kind of a similar circumstance, really impacted my revision process when I was writing scenes in the book where this mom is in the ICU with her 2 children, and there is no alternative source of the drug in the book. I had spent months at that point researching and crowdsourcing people at the CDC and the NIH and the WHO, who, by the way, none of them are responsible for any mistakes in the book. Those are all on me. But one of them suggested using camels as the vector for my fictional virus. And I actually got to travel to Spain and Morocco, where I met several very nice, presumably disease-free camels. And I also met some Moroccan physicians who I was able to stay in touch with throughout the real-world pandemic that ensued. And I met writers that live in Morocco as well, who I also stayed in touch with. So at this point, it was late 2019, early 2020, and the book was kind of shaping up to be a dramatic, but not completely implausible cautionary tale. So everyone who was unlucky enough to ask me what I was working on at that point got an earful of epidemiological terms, and people would be backing away from me a little bit as I was talking. But I did see the book at that point as this could really happen kind of scenario. I did not foresee it happening then. I really thought that this was a little bit more theoretical. The world does periodically experience pandemics. It has happened many times in the past. It will happen again in the future. And then I was on a book tour for The Antidote for Everything in the first week of March 2020 in New York City. And I realized New York City was shutting down. There was nobody on the subway. There was no one at LaGuardia. We canceled everything, the whole tour for The Antidote for Everything. I flew home. And it was right around then, right, that it was becoming obvious that this was not going to be some regional outbreak or some insignificant thing. This was going to really profoundly affect society. And my editor called me, and she said that we needed to have a meeting with the publisher to decide whether or not to go forward with the publication of Doctors and Friends, because we would all have experienced a pandemic by the time the book comes out, and who is going to want to read that? And not only will we all have experienced a pandemic, but there's no way that we can read a book like this without the filter of our own experience now. And in fact, there's a chapter in the book called Every Armchair Virologist in America. That's all of us now, right? We all know way more than we did before. But ultimately, they did decide that they would publish the book. And my editor had a request, which was she wanted to know if I could shift the storyline a little bit away from the infectious disease doctor with the kids and more towards showing what it was like to be a medical worker on the front lines. Because, she said, we will have all lived through a pandemic, but we won't have all lived through a pandemic on the front lines. We won't have all had direct experience caring for patients and so forth. So I did keep the storyline with the infectious disease doctor, but now it's one of 3 perspectives that you see in the book. There's also an ER doctor in New York City. She's my pupil. She's probably my favorite character in the book. She's pretty snarky, but she's also underneath very empathetic. And right before she leaves the country for this trip with her med school girlfriends to go to Spain, her husband kind of drops a bomb on her and tells her he's got this huge life change planned, this big secret, and it does not have anything to do with an affair. Then there's another character who is an OBGYN in San Diego. And she's kind of the glue of their group. She's the mother figure. She's the one that keeps them all bonded. You know how in your friendships with multiple people, there's usually one person that is responsible for getting everybody together and keeping in touch and doing all those things. So Hannah, the OBGYN in the book, is that person. And ironically, because she spends her days and her nights delivering babies, she has been struggling all of her adult married life with infertility and wants nothing more than to have a child, but she can't. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, she realizes that she's pregnant. So these other characters do have significant storylines now. And if you are one of the people who read The Antidote for Everything, my second novel, the The main character in that book, a urologist named Georgia, is also a very pivotal character in Doctors and Friends. She's not a point of view character. You don't see inside her head, but the plot does revolve around her in some ways. So all of these books, again, are a little bit like spin-offs rather than a series where one character has a small part and one has a much larger part in the next one. So I made a few other revisions as well after COVID happened. I added Zoom scenes because how can you have a pandemic without video conferencing in your pajamas? And I did contract COVID myself and developed long-term cardiac and neurologic symptoms, although I guess that is another story altogether. But it did change my perspective because I had no sooner written about a viral pandemic with a weird neurologic side effect than we lived through a viral pandemic and I developed a weird neurologic side effect. So I know that all of you at this point do have severe pandemic fatigue. And I want to say this book is not about COVID. It is not meant to be reflective of what we actually endured, but you will, of course, see parallels. It's not entirely grim either. I tried to put humor into the book when I could. And as an illustration of that, I will tell you that the governmental and societal response to the virus in the book was very unified. Everyone agreed on what to do and they did it. And that's kind of funny, right? There are also children in the book and work relationships and romances, and those things were kind of inherently funny too. My own children are captivated with the idea that the mom in the book has to pick between her kids. So now in my house, whenever anybody screws up, the other ones are like, you'd pick me, right? I would also say that there is some sweetness in the book. All three of my novels have revolved around the concept of friendship as a fundamental human relationship. And for me, this is kind of personal because I have a real life group of 6 women who are my best friends from medical school. And we stay in touch. We text every day pretty much. We travel together once or twice a year. We all went to Spain and Morocco. When I was writing Doctors and Friends, one of us actually lived there because her husband's in the military and they move every 2 years. So we visited her all over the globe. And we have lived through, all the things, marriages and divorces and major illnesses and children and teenagers and transcontinental relocations and deaths and family things. And so these are the people that I really love the most when it comes to friendship. And I wanted to kind of try to reflect some of that intensity in the books. Finally, after COVID hit, we did have to make decisions about which of the events and portrayals in the book that differed from our own, deeply weird reality we would leave in place. And it turned out that some things I got really accurate about what a pandemic would be like, and other things are completely different from what we experienced. And my editor insisted, and I now agree, that the right way to end this book would be on a note of hope and optimism. And I think that's the beautiful thing about fiction is the author controls the universe and you can end it however you want. And I did end the book in a way that I think is hopeful and optimistic. So if you're afraid to read the book, I hope you'll give it a chance. I am deeply, deeply grateful to all of you for being readers and for being willing to come out and listen to somebody talk about a book, and even for being willing to listen to somebody talk about a pandemic-themed book. But I hope that the book offers you more than just that. And thank you also so much for your support of independent bookstores and education. Thank you. Yeah. I'm happy to answer a few questions if you have time, if anyone has any. Yeah. An alien invasion. No, I'm just kidding. So I think the next book is going to be about a big secret in a marriage. And I would actually like to write it as a dual point of view from a male and female perspective. The man in the relationship is a venture capitalist who's working on products to expand the length of the human lifespan, and the woman is an orthopedic surgeon who discovers something very startling about his past. That's the first time I've said that to anyone. Thank you for that question. Yes.
I'm curious about, you mentioned earlier that the global incidents and the doctors in Africa had to make the decision as to which of the medical workers would get it, and what that process was, and how did that influence your work on the process of which child would get it?
Well, I realized I kind of left you hanging there because if you're not familiar with that story, I didn't tell you which one he gave the drug to. Do you guys know that story? Anybody know? So in real life, in the Sierra Leone incident at the medical aid camp, the guy actually wound up splitting the drug, which he was told by the drugs manufacturer was some kind of biopharmaceutical startup in a garage in San Diego, if I remember correctly. This drug was not far along down the pipeline, but they didn't think that dosing would be effective, and he wound up giving it half to each person, and they both survived. So that actually had a happy ending as well. I think that was really, for me, the genesis of the plot line. I knew I wanted to write about an infectious disease doctor. I kind of wanted to model her character on the personality of my late father. He died suddenly, and he was, my person, and he had a kind of a singular personality. He was very logical, very data-driven, funny, and prepared. So there's a scene that you guys will read in the beginning of Doctors and Friends early on, where the main character, the infectious disease doctor, is at a big fancy party, and there's these huge glass urns full of water, like ceiling height, and one of them springs a leak and starts spraying water out onto this party. And in real life, that happened at my wedding in Charlotte at Quail Hollow. So my dad, who, first of all, had to be forced into a tuxedo, he didn't even own a suit, he took his toolkit with him from Kentucky to my wedding and happened to have a siphon and duct tape and all this stuff, and he repaired this big urn at the wedding and kept it from exploding. So I thought I kind of like this character to be a little bit like my dad, but I didn't know what was going to happen with her, because in most fiction, there's some hook that draws you in. There's some central question that you want to find the answer to in a book. And so for Kira, my character in the book, the central question is, which child did she pick, and how did she handle that decision, and what were the impacts and implications of it in her life afterwards? What were the ethical things that she wrestled with? And so when I read the book, Crisis in the Red Zone, I thought, oh, well, here's like the ultimate ethical, moral question. Like when you have to make a decision between two people, how do you do it? Especially when they are your people. So that really was a very formative bit of research that I did for the book.
I actually started reading it this afternoon when I got it, and that scene is fantastic. But also what I noticed is you shifted the chronology, so it's kind of what happened. It's at the end of the pandemic where the book starts. Do you shift chronology through the book?
So there's 4 sections. Oh, and I would encourage you guys also to read the chapter titles because I have fun with chapter titles. So the first section is the virus is called ardiovirus, which was a suggestion from somebody at the CDC who helped me tease out the clinical characteristics of it. So after ardiovirus is the first section that you read. So you're entering the book after the pandemic, and that's when you first realize that the main character has had to make some kind of decision that haunts her. And then it shifts into the pre-pandemic days, right before the pandemic happens, when they're all traveling together and the world is normal, the before days. Then it's during the pandemic, And then it goes right back to the same scene in the last section of the book where you find out which choice she made.
It's great.
Thank
I
you.
was hooked immediately. And I love that scene. And it's fantastic to know that was your dad.
Yeah.
It happened to you.
Yeah. I haven't told anybody that story either, I don't think. Anything else? Yes, in the back.
The covers of your book are absolutely beautiful, all three of them. And they're doing the intersection of anatomical illustrations and botanical illustrations. Do you have involvement in the design of the covers?
Well, forgive me if you've heard me tell the cover story before. So authors don't have cover approval when you're with a traditional publisher, one of the big 5 publishers. They did ask me if I had a request for the cover of The Queen of Hearts, which remember is about a cardiologist, and I said I wanted it to have a vintage-looking drawing of an anatomic heart. And look at it if you don't have it on you, look at it when you go upstairs. So the publisher thought that a naked heart would gross people out. So the graphic designer told me, I'm going to cover it in this mixture of celebratory and funereal flowers to illustrate the circle of life in a medical practice. And I'm going to make the background blue like Scrubs. There's going to be some birds and some bees woven into the flowers. And it turned out to be beautiful. I mean, it's a really artistic, interesting cover. It was on a bunch of best cover lists of 2018, and it got the book a lot of attention. So much so that the publisher told me that they wanted to carry on the concept of having the cover art reflect the medical specialty of the protagonist. And I said, y'all know my next book is about a urologist, right? And that's going to be a lot of flowers, but okay. I was actually really curious to see what they did with it. So you can see that cover upstairs as well. And then Doctors and Friends, they kind of went really subtle on the viral imagery because, again, we didn't want to freak people out. Like, I do want people to realize the book is more than just it's not a pandemic thriller, really. It's more of a character-driven story. But yes, I agree. The covers are very beautiful.
Do you have paintings at home of the other two? I know that.
I have the Queen of Hearts blown up. My husband gave it to me for Mother's Day once. Yeah, it's so pretty. And wouldn't that be a cool job to be a graphic designer for book covers? I think that would be awesome. Well, yeah, and book covers tend to be trendy. You know, they go through phases where they all have the same fonts and imagery and stuff. But I think the Queen of Hearts was one of the really early botanical, certainly the only botanical anatomic combination I know of at the time. I think I saw a hand here. Well, so I think most authors tend to divide themselves into somewhere along a continuum between 2 extremes, one of which is you're a plotter and you outline and you know what's going to happen ahead of time, or you're a pantser, a seat of your pants person, and you just vomit out words without a clue until some kind of coherent story takes shape. I'm more towards the pantser end. I've tried very hard to outline, and I actually teach outlining in some of my writing classes, but I find it very difficult to do until I'm revising. So for me, the process is pretty character-driven in the beginning. I think, what's my protagonist like? What's her personality and her background and her attributes? And how does her speech sound? And what things does she prioritize? And where does she live? And, all of that kind of thing. And then I try to think of what's the big question this book is going to answer for her? What's the thing that she's going to face that's going to make you want to keep turning the pages to find out? And usually you can kind of encapsulate something like that into one sentence, which I find really helpful now when I'm writing, is to think, okay, what's the one sentence hook for this book going to be? And then I sit down and I vomit out words, and it's a huge incoherent mess, and it takes a lot of revision. Is that anything else? All right, one more.
How are you feeling? I know you mentioned some long-term COVID.
Yeah, I don't mind talking about that because I write about it fairly frequently on Facebook and sometimes in articles. But So my main symptom from long COVID is something called parosmia. Is anybody familiar with that? So you all know people who lost smell during COVID, and that's called anosmia. And for me, I lost it, but instead of coming back about 3 months after I had COVID, I started smelling everything in a completely toxic way. So anything with a scent of its own smells to me kind of like rotting meat. I'm sorry to tell you this because people are the worst to me, especially if they wear perfume, but food and alcohol and lemons, garlic, anything with a strong scent to me smells revolting. And I lost weight in the beginning. I kind of got to where I could eat again after a while. But that bad smell has not gone away. And the worst thing about it for me is like cuddling my kids. You know how you kind of like bury your nose in the back of their little necks, and well, maybe not my teenage son, but my little one. But now they smell like a corpse, and it's so awful. Like, it's hard to describe how much that bothered me in the beginning. I just wanted to claw my face off. The other main symptom I had is something called dysautonomia, where my heart rate jacked way up and would be in the 130s, 140s for a few months. And even now when I'm standing, I'm lightheaded a little bit and fatigued, and I don't have the same exercise tolerance. So I do take medication for that, and it's somewhat improved by the stuff that I'm taking, but I definitely feel 40 years older than I felt before COVID. And I'm, of course, hopeful that somebody will figure out how to deal with that better. Other people have had it far worse, I know, but for me, that's what long COVID has been like. Anything else? I had COVID in 2020 before vaccines. But yes, I was, and boosted. Well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to have talked to you tonight, and I'm happy to sign books upstairs. Thank you.
Sherry, I was going to take that one.